The freight train's brakes screamed against frozen rails as it pulled into Camp McCoy on a bitter February morning in 1945, carrying its cargo of 24 Japanese prisoners through the Wisconsin countryside. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his face against the frost-covered window, watching snow-heavy pine trees give way to orderly dairy farms that stretched toward distant silos. Everything here spoke of abundance. Red barns bursting with stored grain, cattle standing fat and content behind wooden fences, farmhouses with glass windows intact, and smoke rising steadily from brick chimneys. The contrast struck him like a physical blow. This was supposed to be a nation weakened by war, struggling to maintain its armies across two oceans while defending a soft homeland unprepared for sacrifice. Yet the train had passed through towns where electric lights burned freely in shop windows, where children walked to school in warm coats, where no building showed scars from bombing raids. The propaganda broadcast from Tokyo had spoken of American industrial collapse, of cities darkened by fuel shortages, of a people growing weary of their government's overseas adventures. But Yamamoto's eyes told a different story. "Move out! Keep it orderly!" Corporal Jimmy Mueller called as the train doors slid open, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The young guard's uniform looked well-fed. Thick wool coat, polished boots, leather gloves that showed no signs of rationing. Behind him, other American soldiers moved with casual efficiency, carrying clipboards and speaking in relaxed voices that suggested men confident in their supply lines. The prisoners filed off the train in careful formation, their wooden clogs crunching against packed snow as they formed ranks beside the platform. Yamamoto noticed how the guards' rifles hung loose at their sides, how their posture suggested routine rather than fear. These Americans acted like men who had never doubted the outcome of this war. Private Hiroshi Tanaka, walking beside Yamamoto, muttered under his breath in rapid Japanese, "Look at their boots! Look at their faces! Where is the hunger we were promised? Where are the signs of a nation bleeding itself dry?" The camp sprawled before them across a gentle valley, its wooden barracks arranged in precise rows behind double fences of barbed wire. Watchtowers stood at regular intervals, manned by guards who stamped their feet against the cold, but showed no signs of the desperate vigilance that should mark a country barely holding its defensive positions. Beyond the perimeter, Yamamoto could see local farmers moving between barn and house, going about their daily routines as if no war existed at all. Muller led them through the main gate, past signs printed in English and Japanese that outlined camp regulations. The translation work was meticulous, professional, another sign of resources that contradicted everything the prisoners had been taught about American military competence. As they walked, Yamamoto caught the scent of cooking food drifting from what appeared to be the mess hall, rich and complex smells that made his stomach contract with sudden, shameful hunger. "You'll be assigned to Barracks 7, Muller announced, consulting his clipboard with the casual authority of someone who had performed this routine dozens of times. "Dr. Reynolds will conduct medical examinations this afternoon. Work assignments begin tomorrow at 0700 hours. The barracks interior struck Yamamoto with another wave of cognitive dissonance. The building was clean, well-ventilated, equipped with actual mattresses rather than straw pallets. Small heating stoves provided warmth that felt luxurious after months of transport in unheated cargo holds. Windows offered views of the surrounding farmland, their glass clean enough to suggest regular maintenance rather than emergency conditions. Tanaka claimed the bunk next to Yamamoto's and immediately began unpacking his few possessions with mechanical precision. "They want us to be comfortable," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "They want us to forget who we are, to become soft like them. This is corruption disguised as mercy." But even as Tanaka spoke, his movements betrayed the relief of finding decent shelter after months of uncertainty. His shoulders relaxed slightly as he tested the mattress quality. His breathing deepened in response to the clean, warm air. Whatever his mind insisted about American manipulation, His body recognized sanctuary when it found it. Through the window, Yamamoto watched Muller setting up some kind of mechanical device near the mess hall, a wooden box with a large metal disc and a hand crank. Other guards gathered around with obvious enthusiasm, their voices carrying across the compound as they debated song selections like men preparing for entertainment rather than psychological warfare. "What do you think they're doing?" asked the youngest prisoner, Private Kenji Nakamura, barely 19 and still carrying the wide-eyed confusion of someone whose war had ended before he could understand what he had been fighting for. "Cultural assault," Tanaka answered with automatic certainty. "They'll try to weaken our spirits with their degenerate music, their material abundance, their false kindness. We must remember that comfort is the enemy of honor." But Yamamoto found himself studying the guards' faces as they worked with their mysterious device. These men moved with the easy camaraderie of people sharing something they genuinely enjoyed, rather than deploying a calculated weapon. Their laughter sounded real, unforced, unscripted, carrying the particular warmth of winter afternoon fellowship. The first notes of a trumpet drifted across the compound as evening approached, carrying a melody unlike anything Yamamoto had ever heard. The music seemed to bend and sway like smoke, defying every rule he had learned about how sound should behave. It wandered rather than marched, suggested rather than commanded, invited rather than demanded submission. Tanaka immediately moved to close the window, his face set in lines of righteous resistance, but several other prisoners had already gathered near the glass, their expressions showing curiosity rather than offense. The music spoke of something beyond national boundaries, something that touched the place where loneliness lived, where homesickness gathered, where the human heart recognized its own rhythms, regardless of the language that contained them. "American jazz," Muller explained later during evening meal distribution, noticing their questions. "Duke Ellington. Figure you boys might appreciate something different from military marches. Gets pretty quiet out here in winter." The meal itself presented another contradiction that Yamamoto struggled to process. Beef stew with actual chunks of meat, bread that looked and smelled fresh, milk in glass bottles that caught the light like small beacons of prosperity. And strangest of all, bottles of dark liquid that Muller identified as Coca-Cola, a drink that seemed to embody everything Japanese propaganda had criticized about American materialism, yet tasted like carbonated celebration. That first sip of Coca-Cola hit Yamamoto's tongue with sweetness so intense it felt like a physical revelation. The bubbles danced against his palate, carrying flavors that had no equivalent in his experience. Artificial but somehow joyful, excessive yet oddly satisfying. He found himself understanding for the first time how a nation might fight a war while its citizens still had access to such luxuries. This was not the desperate abundance of a people consuming their final reserves. This was the casual prosperity of a country that could afford to manufacture happiness in bottles and distribute it to prisoners of war without a second thought. Lying on his comfortable mattress that first night, listening to the distant sound of guards playing cards and sharing stories in their warm towers, Yamamoto felt something crack open inside his carefully constructed worldview. Everything he had been taught about American weakness, about the inevitable victory of spiritual discipline over material decadence, about the moral superiority of sacrifice, all of it was colliding with evidence his own senses could not deny. If stories like this make you question what you do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. Dr. Patricia Reynolds conducted her medical examinations with the methodical care of someone who had learned to see beyond uniforms to the human bodies they contained. Her temporary clinic occupied a corner of the camp's administration building, equipped with supplies that further challenged every assumption Yamamoto had carried about American military resources. Real medicine, clean bandages, instruments that gleamed with the kind of maintenance that suggested abundance rather than desperate conservation. "Any chronic conditions?" she asked through Corporal Mueller's translation, her stethoscope moving across Yamamoto's chest with professional gentleness. "Injuries from before capture? Pain anywhere?" The questions themselves carried an implication that struck Yamamoto as almost surreal. This American doctor seemed genuinely concerned about his long-term health, as if his well-being mattered beyond his utility as a prisoner. When she noted his slightly elevated heart rate and suggested additional rest time during work assignments, he found himself staring at her in confusion that bordered on suspicion. Later, walking between barracks and mess hall, he observed the daily routines that governed life at Camp McCoy. Guards moved with relaxed authority rather than the harsh vigilance he had expected. Work details focused on camp maintenance and assistance with local farming operations. Tasks that seemed designed to keep prisoners occupied rather than to extract maximum labor from enemy soldiers. The morning jazz concerts had become a fixture that divided the prisoners into distinct camps. Tanaka led a group that made a show of ignoring the music, continuing their calisthenics and uniform maintenance with exaggerated dedication. But even among his followers, Yamamoto noticed subtle signs of attention, heads tilted slightly toward the speakers, work rhythms that unconsciously matched the bass lines, moments of distraction when particularly complex solos demanded recognition. Private Nakamura had begun asking questions that made everyone uncomfortable. During their third day at Camp McCoy, while assigned to help repair a damaged section of fence, he wondered aloud why the wire faced inward rather than outward. "Are they keeping us in?" he asked, "or keeping something else out?" Muller, working nearby with wire cutters and replacement posts, overheard the question and paused in his work. "Bit of both, I suppose. Regulations say you boys need secure quarters. But mostly it's to keep local kids from wandering over and bothering you during rest hours." The casual honesty of this response left the prisoners exchanging glances that carried layers of confusion. In their understanding of captivity, guards maintained prisoners through fear and strict separation from civilian populations. The idea that fencing might protect enemy soldiers from unwanted visitors suggested a kind of institutional consideration that had no place in their mental framework for how conquering armies should behave. These small contradictions accumulated like snowfall, each one individually insignificant but collectively transforming the landscape of their expectations. The guards learned their names and used them correctly. The mess hall served portions that erred on the side of generosity rather than calculated minimum nutrition. When Private Sato developed a persistent cough, Dr. Reynolds provided actual medication and adjusted his work schedule without being asked. But it was the civilian visitors who created the most profound dissonance. On their fifth day at Camp McCoy, a delegation from the local Red Cross chapter arrived for routine inspection, bringing books, writing materials, and small gifts that included more bottles of Coca-Cola and packages of what Muller identified as chewing gum. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, a middle-aged woman whose son served somewhere in the Pacific, moved among the prisoners with the kind of determined kindness that suggested personal rather than professional motivation. When she offered Yamamoto a stick of spearmint gum, her eyes held something that looked almost like apology. "I know this can't make up for being so far from home," she said through Muller's translation. "But I wanted you to know that some of us remember you're somebody's sons too." The gum itself proved another small revelation. Sweet, clean flavors that lasted far longer than seemed reasonable. An almost meditative chewing motion that somehow eased tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. Another example of American excess that served no practical purpose, yet provided genuine comfort, like the jazz music, like the Coca-Cola, like the clean mattresses and heated barracks. That evening, writing his first letter home since capture, Yamamoto found himself struggling with questions of what truth he was allowed to convey. How could he describe Camp McCoy to family members who were likely enduring bombing raids and food shortages? How could he admit that his captors treated him better than some of his own officers had during training? How could he acknowledge the growing suspicion that everything he had been taught about American character might require fundamental revision? "We are well treated according to international law," he wrote finally, choosing words that conveyed information without challenging the worldview of people who needed to believe their suffering served a righteous cause. "The Guards maintain proper discipline. We continue to uphold the honor of our unit and our Emperor." But even as he wrote these careful phrases, the taste of spearmint gum lingered in his mouth, like evidence of a more complex reality. Tanaka's response to these accumulated contradictions took the form of increasingly rigid adherence to military protocols. He led morning calisthenics with fierce precision, maintained his uniform with obsessive care, and spoke only Japanese with a purity that excluded even practical English words the others had begun unconsciously adopting. His dedication had the quality of a man building walls against rising water. "They want us to become like them," he insisted during their evening discussions. "Soft, undisciplined, grateful for their material corruption. Every comfort they offer is a step away from everything that makes us who we are." Yet Yamamoto noticed that even Tanaka had begun unconsciously humming jazz melodies during his uniform maintenance routines. The music seemed to bypass ideological defenses, settling into memory through simple repetition and emotional honesty. Duke Ellington's sophisticated arrangements spoke a language that transcended national boundaries, complexity embraced rather than feared, individual expression balanced within collective harmony, beauty that emerged from controlled chaos rather than rigid order. On Sunday morning, church bells from the nearby town of Sparta drifted over the compound, mixing with the distant lowing of cattle and the occasional rumble of freight trains carrying grain and timber toward the war effort. These American rhythms had begun to feel familiar, predictable in ways that provided comfort rather than alienation. The prisoners had unconsciously adjusted their own schedules to accommodate the patterns of this Wisconsin valley, waking to the sound of farm trucks on distant roads, eating meals that coincided with local customs, falling asleep to the peaceful sounds of a countryside untouched by war. The realization that he was adapting, that they were all adapting, struck Yamamoto as both inevitable and somehow dangerous. Each day at Camp McCoy eroded another piece of the certainty that had carried him through enlistment, training, and deployment. Each small kindness from guards and civilians challenged the hatred that was supposed to sustain him through captivity. Yet without that hatred, without the clear lines between ally and enemy, between honor and corruption, between home and foreign territory, who was he supposed to be? The letter arrived on a grey morning in mid-March, delivered by Red Cross courier, along with a bundle of other mail that had taken 3 months to reach Camp McCoy through military censors and international relief organizations. Yamamoto's mother wrote in the careful calligraphy that had shaped his childhood, each character formed with the precision of someone who understood that words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning. The cherry trees bloomed early this year, though there are fewer to see than in peacetime. Young Keiko from next door helps with the garden now that her brothers are away. We plant vegetables where flowers once grew. The radio brings news of glorious sacrifices made by our brave soldiers. I pray daily that honor guides your steps wherever duty has taken you. Between those carefully composed lines, Yamamoto read a more complex story. Food shortages severe enough that ornamental gardens had become agricultural necessity. Labor shortages that put teenage girls in roles previously filled by grown men. Government propaganda working overtime to maintain morale in communities that had sent their young men to distant battlefields. His mother's prayer about honor felt less like encouragement than like desperate hope that some meaning could be extracted from the enormous costs their nation was paying. He folded the letter and placed it in his footlocker beside the half-empty bottle of Coca-Cola he had been rationing like medicine. The contrast between his mother's careful omissions about hardship and his own daily experience of American abundance created a moral vertigo that left him staring at the barrack ceiling during what should have been sleep hours. Similar letters had reached other prisoners, creating ripples of unease throughout their small community. Private Nakamura's family wrote about temporary difficulties with heating fuel that suggested winter months spent in unheated rooms. Lance Corporal Ishida learned that his younger sister had left school to work in a munitions factory, her education sacrificed to the demands of total war. Each piece of news from home highlighted the widening gap between their lived reality at Camp McCoy and the suffering of families they had been fighting to protect. "They're making us complicit," Tanaka announced during one of their evening discussions, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose certainty was costing him increasing effort to maintain. "Every day we accept their comfort. Every time we eat their food or listen to their music, we betray everyone at home who sacrifices for our cause." But Corporal Muller had begun sharing stories during work details that complicated even this interpretation. His own brother served with the army in the Philippines, writing letters that described Japanese soldiers fighting with desperate courage, even when their supply lines had been cut for months. American troops had developed grudging respect for enemies who continued resistance long past any reasonable hope of success, who shared their last rice balls with wounded comrades, who died rather than abandon positions that served no strategic purpose except to uphold promises made to units that no longer existed. "Your people don't quit," Muller observed, while they worked together to repair storm damage to the camp's fence line. "Got to respect that, even when it makes our job harder. Takes something special to keep fighting when you know the war's already lost." These comments carried implications that made Yamamoto's chest tight with conflicted emotions. Mueller spoke as if Japanese defeat was an established fact, as if the outcome of the war had been determined by mathematical calculations of industrial capacity rather than by spiritual factors like dedication and moral purpose. Yet he expressed genuine admiration for the qualities that Japanese soldiers displayed even in hopeless circumstances, a recognition that their sacrifice meant something regardless of strategic results. The jazz concerts continued each morning, gradually expanding beyond background music into informal cultural education. Muller had begun explaining the historical context of different pieces, describing how African-American musicians had created beauty from suffering, how Jewish composers fleeing Europe had contributed to America's artistic landscape, how young people dancing in ballrooms while their brothers fought overseas were creating joy as an act of resistance against despair. These revelations struck the prisoners with the force of physical blows. They had been taught that Americans were individualistic to the point of social fragmentation, lacking the spiritual unity that comes from shared sacrifice for collective purposes. But this music spoke of community forged through adversity, of artistic collaboration that transcended racial and ethnic divisions, of cultural resilience that suggested depths they had not imagined. Dr. Reynolds had begun conducting informal English conversation sessions during her weekly medical checkups, partly to improve communication for practical purposes, but increasingly because she had noticed the prisoners' hunger for understanding their captor's worldview. Her questions probed gently at concepts that had no direct equivalence between their languages: individual rights balanced with social responsibilities, democratic participation in government decisions, the role of dissent in strengthening rather than weakening national unity. "In your country," she asked Yamamoto during one of these sessions, "who decides what music people can listen to?" The question seemed almost nonsensical until he began working through its implications. In Japan, Cultural content was guided by authorities who understood how art should serve national purposes, how individual expression needed to align with collective goals. The idea that people might choose their own entertainment without considering its impact on social harmony suggested the kind of chaos that would destroy any functional society. Yet the Americans around him seemed to function quite well, despite their apparent lack of cultural discipline. Their military operated with impressive efficiency. Their economy produced abundance that exceeded any propaganda claims about Japanese industrial capacity. Their civilians supported the war effort while maintaining personal freedoms that should have made organized resistance impossible. The contradiction left Yamamoto feeling unmoored from beliefs that had once provided clear guidance about right and wrong, about the proper relationship between individual desires and collective needs, about the nature of strength and weakness in human societies. Late at night, he lay on his comfortable mattress, listening to the peaceful sounds of the Wisconsin countryside, and wondered whether adaptation to these circumstances constituted survival or betrayal. Each letter from home increased his guilt about the warmth of his barracks, the adequacy of his food, the kindness of his captors. Each day at Camp McCoy made returning to a world of rigid hierarchy and unquestioned authority seem less like homecoming than like imprisonment. Yet what was the alternative? To accept that everything he had been taught about American decadence was wrong would mean acknowledging that the war itself had been based on fundamental misunderstandings. That the sacrifices made by his family, his community, his entire generation might have served purposes that could not bear honest examination. The weight of these questions followed him through his daily routines, making even simple tasks like eating or listening to music feel like moral choices that carried consequences he could not yet understand. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. April brought a thaw that transformed the Wisconsin landscape into something that reminded Yamamoto achingly of spring mornings in his childhood village. Muddy fields gave way to tentative green shoots, dairy cows ventured farther from their barns, and the air carried scents of earth and possibility that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to memory. The camp's work details expanded to include assistance with local farming operations, bringing prisoners into direct contact with civilian life in ways that continued to challenge every assumption they had carried about American society. The Morrison farm lay 2 miles south of Camp McCoy, accessible by a gravel road that wound between stands of oak and maple trees beginning to show their first leaves. Old Henrik Morrison had lost both sons to the war, one to the European theater, one to the Pacific, and found himself facing spring planting season without the help he needed to maintain operations that had been in his family for 3 generations. The arrangement that brought Japanese prisoners to work his fields struck everyone involved as both practical necessity and profound irony. Yamamoto found himself assigned to a crew that helped prepare the east pasture for corn planting, work that involved removing stones, repairing fence lines, and spreading fertilizer with the kind of methodical patience that agricultural seasons demanded. Morrison himself worked alongside them. A weathered man in his 60s, whose English included casual profanities that Corporal Muller translated with obvious embarrassment. "Says the damn rocks grow back every winter like weeds," Muller explained during one of Morrison's more colorful monologues about geological persistence. "Swears his grandfather fought the same stones 50 years ago." The old farmer's attitude toward his Japanese workers seemed guided by practical considerations rather than political abstractions. He demonstrated proper techniques for operating equipment, shared thermos coffee during rest breaks, and corrected their methods with the patient irritation of someone who cared more about results than about national origins. When Private Nakamura proved particularly adept at machinery repair, Morrison began requesting him specifically for equipment maintenance tasks. These interactions provided Yamamoto with his most direct exposure to ordinary American civilian life, revealing complexities that propaganda had never addressed. Morrison mourned his absent sons with genuine grief, yet harbored no apparent resentment toward the enemy soldiers who worked his land. He complained about government regulations and wartime shortages, while simultaneously expressing fierce pride in American industrial capacity and military organization. He treated the prisoners with casual equality, while maintaining clear authority over working arrangements. The contradictions multiplied during shared lunch breaks, when Morrison's neighbor, Mrs. Anna Kowalski, often brought additional food for the work crews. Her own husband served with the Navy in the Atlantic, leaving her to manage both household and farm responsibilities while caring for 2 young children. Yet she approached the prisoners with the kind of determined hospitality that suggested ideological positions subordinated to immediate human concerns. "You boys are too thin," she would announce through Muller's translation, distributing sandwiches made with actual meat and fresh bread that carried flavors Yamamoto had nearly forgotten. "Can't work proper on empty stomachs, no matter where you come from." Her children, a 7-year-old girl named Susan and a 5-year-old boy called Tommy, showed the kind of unguarded curiosity that adults had learned to suppress. They stared openly at the prisoners' uniforms, asked frank questions about Japanese food and customs, and offered to share toys and candy with the unconscious generosity of people too young to understand that national boundaries should create personal boundaries. Tommy proved particularly fascinated by origami techniques that Nakamura demonstrated during rest periods, his small fingers working carefully to fold paper scraps into recognizable animal shapes. The sight of an American child learning Japanese art forms from enemy prisoners of war created moments of cognitive dissonance that left even the guards shaking their heads at the war's capacity for producing surreal juxtapositions. Dr. Reynolds had begun accompanying the work details as part of what she called preventive medical oversight, but her real purpose seemed focused on observing how prisoners adapted to increased interaction with civilian populations. She noted changes in posture, speech patterns, and social dynamics that suggested psychological adjustment happening faster than anyone had anticipated. "You're looking more like farmers and less like soldiers every day," she commented to Yamamoto during one of her informal evaluations. "That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it raises questions about what happens when you eventually go home." The observation touched on fears that had been growing in Yamamoto's mind as spring work continued. Each day spent in civilian clothes, operating civilian equipment, sharing civilian concerns about weather and crop yields, seemed to erode some essential military identity that he wasn't certain he wanted to lose but couldn't figure out how to preserve. The man who planted corn and repaired fence lines felt increasingly disconnected from the soldier who had once unquestioningly followed orders to defend emperor and homeland. These changes became most apparent during the evening jazz sessions, which had evolved into informal cultural exchange programs where guards and prisoners shared music from their respective traditions. Mueller had brought recordings of country music and classical pieces alongside the jazz standards, while several prisoners had begun attempting to reproduce Japanese folk melodies using improvised instruments and vocal arrangements. Tanaka participated in these sessions with obvious reluctance, but even he seemed unable to resist the gravitational pull of musical expression that transcended language barriers. When he finally contributed a haunting rendition of a traditional mountain ballad, his voice carried emotional depths that formal military bearing had never revealed. The guards listened with respectful attention, recognizing artistic beauty regardless of its cultural origins. "Never heard anything like that before," Muller commented afterward. "Sounds like it comes from somewhere very old, very far away." The evening concluded with an impromptu performance where American jazz harmonies supported Japanese melodic structures, creating hybrid musical expressions that belonged fully to neither tradition, yet somehow honored both. Yamamoto found himself humming these fusion melodies during the next day's farm work, his voice unconsciously blending elements from two musical worlds that were supposed to remain forever separate. The taste of Mrs. Kowalski's sandwiches lingered in his memory alongside the sound of children learning origami and the sight of corn shoots emerging from soil he had helped prepare. These accumulated experiences felt like a second education running parallel to his military training, lessons in complexity, contradiction, and the human capacity to create meaning from circumstances that defied simple interpretation. Yet beneath the satisfaction of useful work and genuine human connection, anxiety grew about what these adaptations meant for his eventual return to a Japan that would expect him to carry untainted loyalty and uncompromised dedication to values that seemed increasingly remote from daily reality. The secret revealed itself through accident rather than intention during a late April afternoon when Corporal Mueller arrived at the barracks carrying a manila folder that had slipped from his grasp while negotiating the steps. Papers scattered across the wooden floor, and as Yamamoto automatically moved to help gather them, his eyes caught fragments of English text that his growing vocabulary allowed him to partially understand. Psychological condition notably improved since arrival. Adaptation to camp routine exceeds expectations. Recommendation for extended cultural programming based on observed benefits. Dr. Reynolds's official reports, written for camp administration and ultimately for military authorities who would decide policies affecting thousands of other prisoners across dozens of similar facilities. The jazz concerts, the work details, the civilian interactions, the gradual integration into community life, all of it had been carefully observed, documented and analyzed as part of what the papers termed rehabilitation through controlled cultural exposure. Muller's face flushed red as he hastily retrieved the scattered documents, but the damage was done. Yamamoto had glimpsed enough to understand that their daily experiences at Camp McCoy represented something more systematic than random kindness or administrative convenience. They were test subjects in an experiment designed to determine how enemy soldiers might be transformed from dangerous fanatics into manageable human beings through strategic application of American abundance and democratic values. That evening, Yamamoto shared his discovery with the other prisoners, watching their faces cycle through expressions of betrayal, confusion, and something that might have been relief. The knowledge that their treatment had been calculated rather than spontaneous somehow made it easier to accept. They could acknowledge the benefits they had received without feeling that gratitude compromised their essential loyalty. Tanaka's response was predictably fierce. So we were right. Everything they've given us, every kindness they've shown, it's all been manipulation. They're trying to break us psychologically because they couldn't defeat us militarily. But Nakamura raised questions that complicated even this interpretation. Does it matter why they treated us well if the treatment itself was genuine? If the food was real, if the medicine was real, if the respect was real? What difference does it make whether it came from policy or from personal choice? The debate that followed stretched long into the night, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of human kindness, the relationship between political purposes and individual actions, the possibility that strategic behavior might still contain authentic compassion. Yamamoto found himself defending positions he hadn't known he held, arguing that Mueller's personal character remained valid regardless of institutional directives, that Dr. Reynolds' medical care had served human needs beyond experimental requirements, that Mrs. Kowalski's sandwiches had carried genuine warmth whether or not they supported official rehabilitation goals. 3 days later, Dr. E. Reynolds herself provided context that further complicated their understanding of their situation. During what had become their regular conversation session, she addressed the discovery directly, rather than pretending ignorance about what had been revealed. "Yes, we've been studying how prisoners respond to different treatment approaches," she acknowledged, "but not for the reasons you might assume. We're trying to figure out how to manage thousands of people who will eventually need to return to civilian life, who will need to find ways to live with what they experienced during the war. The kindness isn't fake just because it serves a purpose." Her explanation introduced concepts that had never appeared in Yamamoto's mental framework for understanding captivity and repatriation. The idea that enemy soldiers might require psychological preparation for resuming peacetime existence, that their wartime experiences might have damaged their capacity for normal civilian life, that former adversaries might share common interests in healing the wounds that military conflict had created. Your government taught you that capture was worse than death, because they needed soldiers who would fight to the end, rather than surrender when defeat became inevitable, Dr. Reynolds continued. But that training creates problems for people who survive capture anyway. You're going to need new ways of thinking about honor, about duty, about what it means to serve your country after the war ends. The jazz concerts took on different significance once Yamamoto understood their therapeutic purpose. Duke Ellington's sophisticated arrangements now represented deliberate exposure to cultural complexity designed to expand rigid thinking patterns. Louis Armstrong's improvisational genius demonstrated how individual expression could enhance, rather than threaten, collective harmony. Billie Holiday's emotional honesty modeled ways of acknowledging pain without being destroyed by it. Yet the music retained its power to move him regardless of its clinical applications. Understanding the psychological theory behind cultural exposure didn't diminish the beauty of Take 5 or the emotional truth of Strange Fruit. If anything, recognizing the careful thought that had gone into their treatment made him more aware of the American capacity for combining practical objectives with genuine human concern. The revelation also cast new light on their civilian work experiences. The agricultural labor that had seemed like simple economic necessity now appeared as carefully designed exposure to American democratic values in practice. Cooperation without rigid hierarchy, problem-solving through discussion rather than command, individual initiative balanced with collective responsibility. Morrison's treatment of the prisoners as valuable workers rather than dangerous enemies had been supported by policies that recognized the rehabilitative value of meaningful labor and civilian contact. But it was the discovery of a second folder, deliberately left where Yamamoto could find it during a subsequent accidental document spill, that provided the most profound shock of all. This one contained correspondence between camp administrators and officials in Washington, discussing post-war policies for prisoner repatriation and the challenges that returning soldiers would face in rebuilding their lives and communities. Recommend careful preparation for eventual return to homeland conditions. Many will face suspicion about their experiences in captivity. Community reintegration may require support for families who question whether returned soldiers retain proper loyalty and dedication to traditional values. The Americans were not just studying how to manage prisoners during wartime captivity. They were developing strategies to help former enemies navigate the psychological complexities of returning to societies that might view their survival with suspicion, their exposure to foreign ideas with alarm, their adaptation to different value systems with outright hostility. Yamamoto sat with this knowledge as evening settled over the camp, listening to the peaceful sounds of the Wisconsin countryside and contemplating the bitter irony that his captors seemed more concerned about his post-war psychological welfare than his own government appeared to be. The jazz music drifting from the guard station now sounded like a kind of preparation, not for betraying his essential identity, but for expanding it enough to survive the contradictions that peace would bring. The empty Coca-Cola bottle on his footlocker shelf caught the last light from the window, its curved glass reflecting the barracks' interior in ways that seemed to symbolize everything complex about his situation. This simple object represented American excess and materialism, yet it had provided genuine pleasure. It embodied cultural differences that should have created unbridgeable divisions, yet it had become part of his daily reality without destroying his sense of who he was. Tomorrow would bring more farm work, more conversations with civilians, more evidence that the world was more complicated than any propaganda had prepared him to understand. And eventually, it would bring the challenge of returning home to explain experiences that defied explanation, to carry truths that might be too heavy for anyone else to bear. The war ended on a Tuesday in mid-August, announced through camp loudspeakers that crackled with static and ceremony in equal measure. Emperor Hirohito's voice reached Camp McCoy through radio waves that had traveled across an ocean and a continent, carrying words that transformed the world's political geography in the space of 15 carefully chosen minutes. Unconditional surrender, foreign occupation, the divine authority that had justified every sacrifice, suddenly acknowledging the futility of continued resistance. Yamamoto listened with the other prisoners gathered in the mess hall, their faces cycling through expressions that had no adequate vocabulary. Relief that the dying had stopped. Grief for everything that ending meant. Confusion about what identity remained for soldiers whose war had concluded in complete defeat. The taste of that morning's Coca-Cola lingered in his mouth like a reminder of all the assumptions that had proven wrong. Tanaka wept without shame, his rigid military bearing finally collapsing under the weight of contradictions he could no longer reconcile through willpower alone. The America he had been taught to despise for its softness and materialism had proven more resilient, more resourceful, and ultimately more humane than the empire that had demanded his absolute loyalty. The cultural corruption he had resisted for months now appeared as strength rather than weakness. The capacity to fight a total war while preserving the domestic abundance and individual freedoms that made victory meaningful. "What do we tell them when we go home?" Nakamura asked during the long discussion that followed the emperor's announcement. "How do we explain that our enemies treated us better than some of our own officers did? How do we describe what we learned about their music, their food, their way of organizing society?" The questions carried implications that extended far beyond personal testimony. They would return to a Japan under foreign occupation, where collaboration with enemy ideas might be viewed as treasonous, regardless of the circumstances that had created understanding. Their families and communities would need to believe that their sacrifices had served noble purposes, that their suffering had meaning beyond the mechanical calculations of industrial capacity and resource allocation that had ultimately determined the war's outcome. Dr. Reynolds addressed these concerns during what had become a formal repatriation counseling program, designed to prepare prisoners for psychological challenges that awaited them in defeated Japan. Her sessions combined practical advice about managing survivor guilt with deeper explorations of how to integrate contradictory experiences into coherent personal narratives. "You don't have to choose between honoring your original beliefs and acknowledging what you've learned here," she explained. "People are complex enough to hold multiple truths simultaneously. The challenge is learning how to live with complexity rather than demanding simple answers to complicated questions." Her words provided some comfort, but Yamamoto understood that the real test would come when he faced neighbors whose children had died in bombing raids while he enjoyed heated barracks and regular meals. When he encountered families who had sold precious possessions to buy black market rice, while he learned to appreciate the casual abundance represented by chewing gum and carbonated beverages. when he tried to explain why survival in captivity had required not betrayal of essential values, but expansion of understanding about what those values might mean in practice. The jazz concerts continued until the final day, taking on the quality of farewell performances that acknowledged the temporary nature of cultural fusion they had created. American guards and Japanese prisoners collaborated on musical arrangements that belonged fully to neither tradition, yet honored both, creating art that suggested possibilities for post-war cooperation that political leaders had not yet imagined. Muller had assembled a collection of recordings that he presented to Yamamoto as a departure gift. Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, and Count Basie preserved on vinyl discs that could travel back to Japan as tangible evidence of the aesthetic revelations that had transformed his understanding of American civilization. The gesture carried risks for both giver and receiver, since possession of enemy cultural materials might raise questions about ideological contamination and inappropriate fraternization. "Music belongs to everybody," Muller said simply. "Maybe someday people will remember that wars end, but songs keep playing." The repatriation process itself proved anticlimactic after months of psychological preparation. Transport trucks arrived on a grey September morning, carrying the prisoners back through landscapes that had become familiar during their Wisconsin captivity. Dairy farms where they had worked harvest details, small towns where church bells had marked the rhythm of their weeks, railway stations where freight trains had carried them toward an uncertain future that had proven more educational than punitive. Yamamoto's final view of Camp McCoy showed morning mist rising from the valley where he had learned to question simple categories of friend and enemy, civilization and barbarism, strength and weakness. The barracks that had housed his gradual transformation stood empty and quiet, ready to receive new groups of prisoners who would undergo their own exposure to American democratic values and material abundance. The fence lines that had defined his captivity now appeared as temporary boundaries rather than permanent divisions, marking differences that might prove more permeable than anyone had assumed. The Pacific crossing took 3 weeks aboard a transport ship that carried them toward a homeland they no longer recognized. Radio reports described cities reduced to rubble, industrial centers dismantled for reparations, civilian populations struggling with malnutrition and disease, while foreign armies maintained order through overwhelming force. The Japan that awaited them bore little resemblance to the proud empire they had been captured defending. Yamamoto's first letter to his mother, written during the voyage home, chose words that conveyed essential truths while avoiding dangerous details. "I have learned much about the complexity of the world beyond our islands. The Americans possess strengths we did not understand, but they also struggle with questions that have no simple answers. I return to you changed but not broken, educated but not corrupted, ready to help rebuild what can be salvaged from what we have lost." Udiud, the taste of his last Coca-Cola, consumed on deck while watching the Japanese coastline appear through morning haze, carried flavors that had become associated with survival, adaptation, and the difficult grace of learning to see former enemies as fully human. That sweetness would linger in memory long after the bottle was discarded, serving as a reminder that even in war's darkest chapters, small acts of unexpected kindness could create spaces for hope. Years later, in letters exchanged with Muller and Dr. Reynolds, Yamamoto would describe how the jazz recordings had influenced a generation of young Japanese musicians, how the agricultural techniques learned at Wisconsin farms had improved crop yields in his reconstructed village, how the lesson that strength could coexist with gentleness had informed his work as a teacher in post-war Japan's democratic schools. The music had indeed broken them apart, but in breaking apart, they had discovered something worth rebuilding. Not the rigid certainties that had led to catastrophic war, but the complex wisdom that recognized former enemies as potential friends, foreign ideas as possible improvements, and cultural exchange as a form of mutual enrichment rather than contamination. The empty Coca-Cola bottle, preserved on his desk beside photographs of family and students, served as a daily reminder that even the most unlikely encounters could produce understanding across boundaries that had seemed absolute. In a world still learning to navigate the aftermath of total war, such reminders carried weight that exceeded their simple material presence. Small acts of humanity, he had learned, were indeed harder to carry than hatred, but infinitely more valuable to preserve. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.